TeraFlex's rear spring retainers for the JT Gladiator prevent the springs from moving out of place during extreme articulation or sudden drops of the rear axle. These are designed for lifted Gladiators with shocks that can expand longer than the rear springs. They fit perfectly with TeraFlex springs, but they also work very well with the factory springs and with TeraFlex's performance spacer lift kits. Begin by placing support under the rear axle. It's best to do so in 2 locations along the axle as well as under the pinion. Disconnect the rear track bar from the axle. Detach the sway bar from the axle. You could also disconnect it from the links, but we found that it's easier just to do it at the axle and then have it all out of the way. Disconnect the shocks from the axle. Loosen the hardware on the axle end of the lower control arm. Remove the hardware from the axle end of the upper control arm so that it is disconnected from the axle. If you are installing this with the factory springs or a performance spacer lift, you will only need to loosen the hardware. Disconnect the calipers from the axle and hang them out of the way. If you have replaced the brake lines with longer brake lines, then you will likely not need to do this. When you lower the axle, it is important that the brake lines do not stretch. We do it one side at a time, but you should be able to lower both sides without too much of a problem. Watch the other lines and hoses connected to the axle, and if you need to disconnect any of these, then do so. Because we already had TeraFlex springs installed, we need to use a pry bar to pop the spring over the spring mount. Insert the upper spring mount into the spring, oriented as shown. On the TeraFlex springs, you will need to pry apart the end of the springs with a screwdriver. Rotate the retainer until the edge of the gap lines up with the end of the spring. Set the upper extrusion into place on top of the upper spring mount. Reinstall the spring. Make sure the spring isolator is in place and that the spring is seated properly. Using a long extension, feed the bolt up into the spring retainer and tighten it down. On the lower end, tie some string around the lower bracket and push it into the opening on the lower spring mount. Pull it up using the string. Attach the bar retainer using the provided hardware. Insert the screwdriver under the spring mount and into the lower extrusion to keep it from spinning. Tighten down the hardware. Reassemble the rear suspension components using the factory torque specifications, as given here. If aftermarket components are used, follow the torque specifications provided in written instructions.